Picture this. It's December 1823, and you're standing in what we now call the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. But forget everything you know about modern winter gear, heated cabins, or emergency rescue services. You're a mountain man named Jeremiah Johnson, and you've just made the kind of mistake that kills people out here faster than a lightning strike. The grizzly bear that tore through your winter camp 3 days ago wasn't just being destructive, it was systematic. It scattered your carefully preserved meat stores across a half-mile of mountainside, trampled your salt supplies into the snow, and left you with exactly 3 rifle bullets, a skinning knife, and maybe 5 days before starvation claims another victim in these unforgiving peaks. Now, I want you to understand something about the scale we're talking about here. When we say winter in the Rockies, we're not talking about a bad day where you need an extra sweater. The temperature has been sitting at 20 below zero for 2 weeks straight. The wind cuts through buckskin like it's tissue paper. And here's the kicker. The nearest trading post is 150 miles southeast through terrain that would challenge a modern snowmobile. Johnson stumbled through that blizzard for 2 days, his body burning through its last reserves of energy. His vision was starting to tunnel. That's one of the early signs of starvation, folks. Your brain literally begins shutting down non-essential functions to keep your heart beating. He was perhaps 12 hours from becoming another cautionary tale about respecting the mountain's power. But sometimes, just sometimes, desperation leads to discovery. Johnson literally fell into salvation. One moment he was trudging through knee-deep snow, the next he was tumbling 15 feet down into what seemed like the Earth's basement. When he managed to strike flint and get a small fire going, he found himself in a limestone cave that stretched back into darkness beyond his torch's reach. And that's when he saw something that made him question his own starving mind. Meat, wrapped in pine boughs and what looked like sage, stacked against the cave wall like cordwood. Not fresh meat, this had clearly been here for months, maybe longer. Some unknown hunter had cached their supplies and never returned. Johnson's first thought was probably gratitude mixed with desperate hunger. His second thought changed the course of frontier history. The meat was frozen solid, not spoiled, not rotting, not covered in the green fur that claimed so many frontier food stores. Frozen, in a cave, in December. Now, you have to understand what this meant to a man who'd spent 5 years losing precious supplies to temperature fluctuations. Mountain men lived or died by their ability to preserve meat and pelts through extreme weather. They'd watched fortunes in beaver pelts rot during unexpected warm spells. They'd seen entire winter supplies spoil when caves proved too warm or too damp. Johnson built his fire and cooked what he needed, but his mind was racing. As the hours passed and his strength returned, he began exploring deeper into the cave system. What he discovered defied everything he thought he knew about how the world worked. The cave maintained a constant temperature. Even as the blizzard raged outside with winds that could knock a man off his feet, even as the surface temperature dropped to levels that froze spit before it hit the ground, the cave held steady at what Johnson estimated was right around the freezing point of water. But here's where it gets really interesting. The deeper chambers, the ones that stretched back into the mountain's heart, stayed even colder. Johnson's primitive thermometer, a strip of metal he used to gauge temperatures for curing hides, suggested these back chambers hovered right around 32 degrees, perfect for preservation. Natural refrigeration that required no ice, no salt, no human intervention whatsoever. Johnson spent that entire winter living with the Shoshone tribe in the valley below, and this is where our story takes on another dimension. The tribal elder, a man called Gray Owl, didn't seem surprised when Johnson described his cave discovery. In fact, Gray Owl smiled the way someone does when a child finally notices something obvious. "Your people," Gray Owl told him through a translator, "always want to fight the mountain. We learned long ago to let the mountain teach us." The Shoshone had been using limestone caves for food storage for generations. But, and this is crucial, they'd never pushed the technique to its limits. They stored meat for weeks, maybe a couple of months. What Johnson was envisioning was something far more ambitious. Through that long winter, Gray Owl taught Johnson to read limestone formations like a book. Some caves were too warm, others too dry. The perfect preservation cave needed specific geological conditions: limestone carved by ancient water flow, chambers that naturally regulated airflow, and most importantly, the right depth to tap into the mountain's consistent underground temperature. By spring of 1824, Johnson had mapped 17 potential caves across 3 mountain ranges. But mapping wasn't enough. He needed to test his theory on a scale that would prove or disprove everything he suspected about nature's hidden refrigeration system. His first real test came that summer, when temperatures in the valleys soared to 95 degrees for 3 consecutive weeks. Other trappers watched helplessly as their hard-won pelts and meat stores rotted in the heat. Meanwhile, high in caves that Johnson had carefully prepared, beaver pelts and venison remained as fresh as the day they'd been stored. Johnson had discovered something that would reshape how people survived on the frontier. But discovery was just the beginning. What happened next would spark conflicts, create communities, and ultimately challenge the very economic foundation of frontier trading. Because when word got out about Johnson's ice caves, everyone wanted to control them. The summer of 1825 didn't just break temperature records, ATN, it shattered them like glass hitting stone. We're talking about heat that made the valleys feel like the inside of a blacksmith's forge. 105 degrees in areas where mountain men typically found relief from prairie summers. Rivers that had run strong for decades dwindled to muddy trickles. Game animals fled to elevations so high that hunting them meant risking altitude sickness and sudden weather changes that could trap you above the tree line. And if you were a trapper or trader trying to make a living in this furnace, you were watching your entire livelihood literally rot before your eyes. William Sublette learned this lesson the hard way at Fort Bridger. Picture a man who'd invested everything, and I mean everything, into a summer trading season. Sublette had $30,000 worth of supplies, staged for the annual rendezvous. In 1825 dollars, that's the equivalent of roughly $750,000 today. Meat, pelts, trade goods, salt for preservation, 10 sir, all of it carefully calculated to turn a profit during the biggest gathering of mountain men in the territory. Within 2 weeks of that hellish heat setting in, Sublette was watching his fortune disappear. The smell alone must have been unbearable. Hundreds of pounds of meat turning into putrid soup, beaver pelts that should have been worth their weight in gold becoming worthless, stinking reminders of nature's power over human ambition. Desperate trappers were paying 10 times the normal price for salt, the only preservation method most of them knew. But here's the thing about supply and demand in the wilderness. When demand skyrockets and supply evaporates, people die. When that salt ran out, men who'd survived grisly attacks and Apache raids faced starvation in the middle of what should have been the most prosperous trading season in years. But high in the mountains, Jeremiah Johnson was about to conduct what he called the Great Experiment. Johnson had spent the previous year, 1824, obsessively preparing for exactly this scenario. He'd filled 7 caves across 3 mountain ranges with elk, deer, bear, and buffalo meat. Each piece wrapped according to methods he'd refined through endless trial and error with Grey Owl's guidance. Pine boughs for moisture control, sage for its natural preservative qualities, and careful positioning within the caves to maximize the limestone's natural cooling properties. Think about the logistics here for a moment. Johnson wasn't just storing a few steaks for next week's dinner. We're talking about tons of meat, transported by mule train to caves that required technical climbing skills to access safely. He'd essentially created a distributed network of natural freezers across hundreds of square miles of some of the most dangerous terrain in North America. The limestone caves, carved by ancient waters that had long since found other paths, maintained their temperatures between 32 and 38 degrees, even as the valleys below baked like bread ovens. Johnson was betting his life, his reputation, and potentially the survival of hundreds of other mountain men on a preservation method that conventional wisdom said was impossible. The 1825 Mountain Man Rendezvous at Henry's Fork became the stage for Johnson's revelation. And what a stage it was. 800 trappers, traders, and adventurers gathered in the brutal July heat. These weren't weekend campers, folks. These were men who'd spent months in isolation, who'd fought off wolves and survived blizzards that would kill modern humans with all our technology. And they were complaining. The conversation around every campfire was the same. Spoiled, supplies, mounting debts, the possibility that this might be the rendezvous that broke the back of the mountain fur trade entirely. Veteran trappers who'd survived 20 years in the wilderness were talking about heading back to civilization because they couldn't afford to lose another season to spoilage. That's when Jeremiah Johnson rode into camp with pack mules loaded with fresh meat. Not just fresh. Some of it had been stored since the previous winter. Meat that should have been rotting pulp was instead perfectly preserved, better than anything available in the sweltering valley. The reaction was immediate and electric. Groups of men gathered around Johnson's mules, prodding the meat, smelling it, unable to believe what they were seeing. Accusations of sorcery flew immediately. In a time when many frontier people still believed in witchcraft and supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, Johnson's meat seemed to defy every law of nature they understood. Some men backed away from his campsite, making signs against evil. Others demanded explanations that made sense in their world of salt curing and smoking techniques. Johnson's response was brilliant. Instead of hoarding his secret or trying to profit immediately, he announced that he would lead any interested party to the nearest cave and demonstrate his methods personally. This wasn't just generosity, this was strategic thinking that would reshape the entire frontier economy. The delegation that followed Johnson into the mountains included some of the most respected names in the fur trade. Jim Bridger himself, the man who'd discovered the Great Salt Lake, rode alongside French-Canadian trappers, Shoshone guides, and traders who'd seen everything the wilderness could offer. The 2-day ride to Johnson's nearest cache gave them time to theorize, argue, and place bets on what they'd find. What they found was a natural cathedral of ice-covered walls and perfectly preserved food. The cave entrance, hidden behind a screen of pine trees and accessible only through a narrow chimney in the rock, opened into chambers that extended deep into the mountainside. The temperature hit them like stepping into a root cellar in July, immediate, blessed relief from the heat that had been torturing them for weeks. Jim Bridger, a man not easily impressed, tasted year-old venison and declared it better than fresh killed. But the real impact came when the delegation returned to the rendezvous, and word spread through the camp like wildfire. Johnson had solved the fundamental problem that threatened to destroy their way of life. But here's where our story takes a darker turn. Because whenever someone threatens an established economic system, that system fights back. Trading post owners like Jacques Fontaine and Silas Hartwell saw their monopoly on frontier food preservation crumbling before their eyes. These men had built fortunes by controlling the supply of salt and other preservation materials. They charged premium prices because trappers had no alternative. Johnson's cave method didn't just offer an alternative, it threatened to make their entire business model obsolete. Fontaine's first move was direct. He offered Johnson $5,000, IGR, roughly $125,000 in today's money, for exclusive rights to the cave preservation technique. When Johnson refused, explaining that survival knowledge should belong to everyone who needed it, Fontaine's approach became significantly less friendly. Within days, Fontaine's men were following Johnson, trying to map his caves and discover his techniques through surveillance. They trailed his mule trains, noted cave locations, and even attempted to place spies among the mountain men Johnson was teaching. But Johnson had anticipated this reaction. Silas Hartwell took a different approach that was arguably more dangerous. He began spreading rumors that cave-preserved meat caused mountain fever, a catch-all term for various illnesses that plagued frontier communities. Hartwell's traders whispered stories of men who'd eaten cave meat and fallen violently ill, of entire camps wiped out by mysterious diseases that could only be traced to Johnson's unnatural preservation methods. This was psychological warfare designed to save Hartwell's salt monopoly by turning people's fear of the unknown against Johnson's innovations. And it might have worked, except for one crucial factor. Johnson had been training other men in his techniques. Black Tom Morrison, a former slave who'd gained his freedom and headed west, became one of Johnson's most dedicated students. Swedish Carl Lundgren, who'd immigrated from Scandinavia with knowledge of ice preservation from his homeland, adapted Johnson's cave techniques with innovations of his own. The Hernandez brothers from Santa Fe brought techniques for preserving chilies and vegetables that complemented the meat storage methods perfectly. By summer's end, over 100 trappers were using variations of Johnson's cave preservation. The trading post's stranglehold on frontier food supply was broken forever, but the war for control of this new knowledge was just beginning. Through 1826 and 1827, something remarkable happened across the American frontier. What had started as one desperate man's survival technique evolved into a social revolution that changed how entire communities approached the fundamental challenge of staying alive in an unforgiving landscape. Communities began forming around prime cave locations, like settlements growing around water sources or gold strikes. But these weren't random gatherings of desperate people. These were organized, specialized groups, where families developed expertise in different aspects of what was becoming a sophisticated preservation craft. Mary Elizabeth Crockett, AIC, and yes, she was related to that Crockett family, became the undisputed master of preserving vegetables and medicinal herbs. While the men focused on meat storage, Mary Elizabeth experimented with root vegetables, discovering that potatoes, turnips, and carrots could survive entire years when stored in the deepest, coldest cave chambers. She developed wrapping techniques using specific combinations of moss and bark that regulated moisture while preventing rot. Think about what this meant for frontier nutrition. Before Mary Elizabeth's innovations, winter vegetable consumption was basically non-existent unless you'd managed to dry or pickle small quantities during harvest season. Scurvy and other nutritional diseases were constant threats. But now, fresh vegetables could be available year-round in locations hundreds of miles from the nearest farming settlement. The Yamamoto family brought an entirely different perspective to the growing cave preservation movement. These Japanese traders had arrived in the Rockies via California, part of the small but significant Asian migration to the American West that most history books ignore. They introduced fish preservation techniques that perfectly complemented Johnson's meat methods. The Yamamotos understood something about salt-curing fish that seemed almost magical to mountain men accustomed to basic smoking techniques. They could take salmon, trout, or mountain whitefish and preserve them for months using combinations of cave cooling and precise salt applications that required far less salt than traditional methods. Their technique meant that fishing communities could store their catches through lean seasons and transport fresh fish across vast distances. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of cave digging as a communal activity. This wasn't just practical cooperation, 12-9, it became a social ritual that bound communities together through shared labor and shared knowledge. Picture a cave digging operation in full swing, 20 or 30 men working in shifts, some wielding pickaxes and shovels, others hauling rock debris, still others testing temperatures and airflow patterns. The experienced cave diggers taught newcomers how to read rock formations, how to identify limestone that would carve easily without compromising structural integrity, how to expand natural chambers without destroying the delicate temperature balance that made preservation possible. These weren't random excavations. Master cave builders like Swedish Carl Lundgren developed techniques for enhancing natural caves that bordered on engineering genius. They learned to control airflow by strategic placement of rocks and wood barriers. They discovered that certain cave shapes maintained better temperatures than others. They even figured out how to create primitive ventilation systems that prevented dangerous gas buildup while maintaining optimal preservation conditions. The spiritual dimension of cave preservation emerged organically from these community-building efforts. Reverend Josiah Whitmore, a Methodist minister who'd headed west to bring Christianity to frontier settlements, witnessed caves that maintained winter temperatures through blazing summers and began preaching about God's iceboxes. Whitmore's sermons described the caves as divine provision for the faithful, natural miracles that proved God's care for those brave enough to venture into the wilderness. His God's icebox theology resonated powerfully with people who'd experienced the life-saving power of cave preservation firsthand. When you've watched your family survive a brutal winter because of meat stored in a mountain cave, it's pretty easy to see divine intervention in the process. Cave blessing ceremonies combined Christian prayers with Shoshone spiritual traditions, creating a unique frontier faith that honored both the Christian God and the mountain spirits that maintained the cave's power. These ceremonies weren't just religious observances, they were community bonding experiences that reinforced the social networks essential for frontier survival. Children growing up in cave preservation communities learned the techniques through songs and games that embedded crucial knowledge in memorable formats. Wrap It Tight in Sage, So Green, Coldest Caves You've Ever Seen was just one of dozens of preservation songs that taught everything from proper wrapping techniques to cave safety procedures. But the ultimate test of this growing underground empire came during the 1827 drought. The settlement at Willow Creek faced complete disaster when their crops failed and game animals vanished from the region. 300 people, men, women, children, elderly settlers who'd invested everything in frontier farms, faced starvation as autumn turned toward winter. This was the moment when Johnson's network would either prove its worth or reveal itself as an interesting but ultimately limited survival technique. Johnson and his network of cave keepers had prepared for exactly this scenario. 17 caves within a day's ride of Willow Creek contained enough preserved food to sustain the entire settlement through winter, but logistics were crucial. Moving 20 tons of preserved meat, vegetables, and pemmican from scattered mountain caves to a desperate settlement required coordination, equipment, and absolute trust among the cave keepers. The rescue operation became legendary across the frontier. Johnson led a convoy of 40 cave keepers, each responsible for specific cache locations. They moved in coordinated groups, emptying caves in predetermined sequences to ensure that no single location was completely depleted. The operation took 3 weeks and required hundreds of pack mules, but it worked. When the convoy reached Willow Creek, the settlement's population had been reduced to eating bark soup and boiled leather. Children were showing signs of serious malnutrition. Adults were making desperate preparations for what they assumed would be their final winter. The arrival of Johnson's preservation network changed everything. Not just the immediate crisis, the entire psychological relationship between frontier communities and the constant threat of starvation. People realized that cooperative food storage could create security that no individual family could achieve alone. This success prompted Johnson's greatest strategic achievement, the Free Cave Covenant. Meeting at Independence Rock in September 1827. Representatives from 62 trapping groups, 7 native tribes, 3 military expeditions, and even reformed trading post owners signed an agreement that would influence frontier culture for generations. The covenant established that any person could claim and improve natural caves for preservation purposes, but no one could monopolize access to cave knowledge or charge fees for basic training. This was revolutionary thinking for an era when most valuable knowledge was closely guarded trade secrets. Captain William Clark, 9th, yes, that William Clark from Lewis and Clark, endorsed the covenant after Johnson's techniques saved his surveying expedition from disaster. Clark's expedition had been trapped by early snowfall in terrain where game was scarce. Without cave-preserved supplies, they would have faced the same fate as the Donner Party 20 years later. The document itself was written on elk hide and signed with charcoal mixed with cave ice, a symbolic choice that emphasized the natural, community-based character of the agreement. But the covenant's real power lay in its establishment of a new frontier ethic. Survival knowledge belonged to everyone who needed it. This principle would echo through American culture for generations, influencing everything from agricultural extension services to open-source software development. The idea that life-saving knowledge should be freely shared rather than hoarded for profit became a foundational element of frontier democracy. But, as 1827 ended and 1828 began, Johnson himself was about to vanish into the same mysterious wilderness that had taught him nature's deepest secrets. Johnson's disappearance in autumn 1828 added the final layer of mystery to a tale that was already passing from history into legend. His final note, discovered by Swedish Carl in the main cave that had started everything, was written in charcoal on a piece of birch bark. All it said was, "Going deeper to find the source of eternal winter." Now, you have to understand what this meant to the mountain men who'd built their lives around Johnson's teachings. This wasn't just losing a teacher or a friend. Johnson had become something approaching a folk hero, a man who'd wrestled knowledge from nature itself and shared it freely with anyone willing to learn. His disappearance left a void that spawned dozens of theories, each more fantastic than the last. Some claimed Johnson had discovered vast ice caves extending miles underground, natural cathedrals of permanent winter that honeycombed the Rocky Mountains. According to these stories, Johnson had found cave systems so extensive and so perfectly preserved that they contained the remains of ancient animals, maybe even evidence of peoples who'd lived in the mountains thousands of years before the Shoshone. Others believed Johnson had integrated so completely with Shoshone spiritual practices that he'd chosen to become one with the mountain, a conscious decision to abandon human society and merge with the natural forces that maintained the cave's power. This theory gained credibility when Grey Owl, Johnson's original teacher, was asked about his disappearance and simply smiled, saying, "The mountain called him home." But the most intriguing account came from Swedish Carl himself, who claimed to have encountered Johnson one final time in spring 1830. Carl was checking cave sites near what's now Glacier National Park when he saw a figure emerging from caves no other man had ever found, caves that seemed to appear and disappear depending on weather conditions and time of day. According to Carl's story, Johnson looked unchanged after 2 years in the wilderness, not older, not weathered by exposure, but somehow more integrated with the mountain environment. They spoke briefly in a mixture of English and Shoshone, with Johnson explaining that he'd found cave systems that connected across hundreds of miles, underground highways that maintained perfect preservation temperatures year-round. Carl claimed Johnson showed him wrapped meat that had been preserved for what seemed like decades, maybe centuries, food left by previous inhabitants of the caves, but inhabitants from when? And why had they abandoned storage systems that represented survival technology more advanced than anything European settlers had developed? Whether Johnson vanished into legend or simply retreated deeper into wilderness that was rapidly being claimed by expanding American settlement, his revolution continued spreading across the frontier with unstoppable momentum. By 1840, over 10,000 frontier inhabitants used cave preservation techniques from the Canadian border to northern Mexico. Military forts incorporated cave storage into their defensive strategies, realizing that sieges couldn't starve out garrisons with access to underground food supplies. Trading post owners who'd initially fought the cave preservation movement found themselves adapting or going out of business. The California gold rush of 1849 succeeded partly because preserved food allowed miners to work claims far from established supply lines. Think about the logistics here. Tens of thousands of men rushing to California from across the continent, many of them completely inexperienced in wilderness survival. Without cave preservation techniques adapted for desert and mountain conditions, the gold rush would have been a humanitarian disaster on an unprecedented scale. When the Transcontinental Railroad was built through the 1860s, work crews used Johnson's methods to feed thousands of workers through scorching desert summers and brutal mountain winters. Railroad companies found that cave preservation was more reliable and economical than shipping fresh supplies across continent-spanning distances. But perhaps the most significant impact was on early refrigeration inventors like Jacob Perkins and Alexander Twining, who studied natural cave cooling to design mechanical systems. These inventors understood that Johnson's caves represented proof of concept for artificial refrigeration. If limestone formations could maintain consistent cold temperatures without human intervention, mechanical systems using similar principles might be possible. The scientific study of natural refrigeration began with detailed analysis of Johnson's original caves. Engineers measured temperature gradients, airflow patterns, and humidity levels in cave systems across the Rocky Mountains. What they discovered led directly to the development of commercial ice-making machines and eventually to modern refrigeration technology. Modern archaeologists have verified Johnson's methods with remarkable precision. The University of Colorado's 2019 expedition used ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging to map cave systems Johnson described in his scattered notes. They discovered that his caves still maintain optimal preservation temperatures after 2 centuries. The expedition found wrapped meat samples that, while no longer edible, showed remarkable preservation after 200 years. Carbon dating confirmed that some samples had been stored using Johnson's exact techniques during the 1820s. The wrapping materials, LAs, sage and pine boughs, had mummified rather than decayed, creating natural packaging that protected the meat from environmental contamination. Today, mountain communities from Montana to New Mexico still practice variations of Johnson's techniques. The annual Ice Cave Festival in Johnson's Valley, Colorado, attracts thousands of visitors who compete in traditional preservation contests, learn cave identification skills, and participate in blessing ceremonies that blend Christian and Native American traditions. Restaurants like the Cave Keeper in Jackson Hole age their meats using original Johnson methods, charging premium prices for steaks and roasts that have been preserved in natural limestone caves. Celebrity chefs have rediscovered cave aging as a technique that produces flavors impossible to achieve through conventional refrigeration. Climate change has sparked renewed interest in Johnson's techniques as sustainable living advocates study how frontier communities survived extreme temperatures without electricity. Survivalist groups practice cave preservation as preparation for potential infrastructure collapse. Environmental scientists analyze cave systems as models for energy-efficient cooling that doesn't contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. Perhaps most remarkably, the Free Cave Covenant's principle of shared survival knowledge has influenced movements far beyond frontier preservation. Open-source software development, community resilience planning, and mutual aid networks all echo Johnson's belief that life-saving knowledge should belong to everyone who needs it. The modern maker movement, with its emphasis on shared technical knowledge and community workshops, operates on principles Johnson established in 1827. When programmers release code under open-source licenses, when communities establish tool libraries and skill-sharing networks, when people choose cooperation over competition in developing survival technologies, they're following paths first blazed by a desperate mountain man who could have hoarded his discovery, but chose instead to share it freely. Jeremiah. Ice Cave Johnson's legacy proves that one winter's desperate discovery, shared freely despite potential profit, can echo through centuries and save countless lives. In our age of climate crisis and social fragmentation, Johnson's story reminds us that the greatest human achievements come not from hoarding knowledge, but from sharing it, not from conquering nature, but from learning to work with natural systems, and not from individual survival, but from community resilience. The caves Johnson mapped still maintain their ancient temperatures, still offer their timeless lessons about working with rather than against the natural world. And somewhere in the deepest chambers of the Rocky Mountains, whether in legend or reality, the man who discovered nature's secret refrigeration continues his eternal search for the source of winter itself. The mountain called him home, and in sharing his knowledge with the world, he made the entire frontier his home as well.